we come to our next talk. There are two people who are talking about a subject. Maybe you can say it's a following of the further debate, but how we can deal with this question nowadays in a totally new frame, you can say. So first of all, let me introduce our two speakers. They are co-workers together in Zürich. His first Professor Dr. Michael Hampe is a full professor of philosophy at the ETH Zurich since 2003 or 4. It's interesting that his studies are, you can see what he was doing later, he was published. You can see direct lines, yeah. He studied philosophy, psychology, and German in Heidelberg and Cambridge, make his master degree in Heidelberg, and then study biology with a focus on neurobiology and genetics, and was a research assistant of philosophy in Heidelberg too. He made his doctorate in 1989, habilitation 1994. He got a few grants and awards. I skipped that in concrete. You can read that if you are interested in that. But he was from 1994 and 1995 fellow at the well-known Wissenschaftskolleg of Berlin. And then from 97 to 99, he got his first professorship of theoretical philosophy at the University of Kassel in Germany. And then after that, from 99 until 2003, professor of philosophy of the University of Bamberg. And since 2000, since this time, he's full professor in Zurich. A current fields of his work is philosophy and history of empirical science, critical theory, and metaphysics. This combination sounds very interesting because if you take one of them, have very often nothing to do with the other side. So science and the public sphere, techniques of self-knowledge. Maybe let me say something about the publications, but not that much. He is published it's a huge frame. So maybe you can see this first one is in German. I can quote in German. First one is about the rules, Regel, coercion, Zwang, and reason, the theoretical and practical philosophy, the reception of organisms, and first is master degree, anti-Cartesianism anthropology. So it was just by Spinoza and Whitehead. So you see the lines of that. And then the books, maybe the most important were, the most of them, you will know them. So this Vollkommene Leben, 4 meditations about the lack. Yes, it's maybe well known, it's translated in several languages. 2011, Tunguska, or the End of Nature, is quite important too. And 2014, Die Lehren der Philosophie, eine Kritik. And the last one, so it's maybe, you know that it's the third enlightenment, die dritte Aufklärung. It's a very interesting view, I think, because it's going back to Hilary Putnam on the one hand, but with other answers and consequences for nowadays. And the newest one I don't know, but I'm interested in, Die Wildnis, die Seele, das Nichts, über das wirkliche Leben. Is that what we have to know since a long time. So this is Michael Hampe. I will greet you very warmly, and I will give some insights of his, his Swiss worker, his postdoctoral position, Dr. Olivier Del Fabbro. Yes, his postdoc of his professorship of philosophy at the ETH in Zurich under the direction of Professor Hampe. He studied philosophy, Italian and media studies in Freiburg and Basel. 2014, he completed his master's thesis on the model of the psychic apparatus in Freud and Derrida. From 2015 to 19, he completed his doctorate in the philosophy of individuation from Gilbert Simondon. The project was supported by the National Research Fund Luxembourg. And his research area, it's just very interesting for the, you can say, international, maybe intercultural context, is a French history and philosophy of science, philosophy of technology, with references to French philosophers, Comte, Bachelard, Canguilhem, Simondon, and Bruno Latour, of course, as well. And on the other side, American pragmatism, Pierce, Dewey, Whitehead. And the special areas, philosophy and history of complex system, artificial intelligence, and cybernetics. He currently is working on 2 projects. If you allow, we can talk maybe in the question or whatever. It's very interesting. It depends on this research area I was pointed out. So, yes, the floor is yours, and you have idea, I think so, how you will deal with that. Yes, you can surprise us. It's you. Thank you so much for coming, and we will be excited about your talk. Please.
Yeah, thank you very much for the kind introduction. Some 25 years ago or so, I was told the most boring thing you can do if you give a talk is to start with the pre-Socratics and end up in the present day, but that's exactly what Olivier Del Fabbro and me will do. We start with thoughts about Anaximander and go via Hobbes to Latour. And what we have to say is relating both to what we just heard by Dalia Nasser and also to what Professor Ogunde said at the very beginning of this conference, where Latour and network thinking was already the topic. I myself will start with the idea that fundamental presuppositions of our thoughts in ontology and in cosmology and in philosophy of nature, fundamental presuppositions which we cannot justify, but which we just have to give, depend on our form of life. And that is itself a meta-philosophical observation, not of myself, but one that you can find in such different thinkers like Marx, Wittgenstein, or Feyerabend. If this observation is right, then ontologies, cosmologies, and philosophies of nature that operate with terms and concepts which we find alien are, to use an idea from science fiction, alien terms and concepts and presuppositions are a sort of signal from different life forms, from life forms that are alien to us, and us has to be indexical term, a term that relates to a certain culture, a certain continent, or a certain epoch. And the very famous saying of Anaximander, and I hope you see his picture now. No. Yeah, but that's not the presentation mode, is it? So this is it. Okay. The famous saying by Anaximander is, to my view, such a signal from a different form of life, from a form of life that is gone now in Europe and that might have been present in other continents. Most of you will know this saying, and the things out of which birth comes about for beings, into these too their destruction happens according to obligation, for they pay the penalty, decay, and retribution, thesis, to each other for their injustice, adikia, according to the order of time. This is how he says, and that's Simplicius talking about Anaximander, these things with rather poetic words. So everything that comes into being lives on other creatures. We know that from animal life that most animal life has to kill plants or other animals in order to stay alive, and that you go down again, die, because you have to pay for this injustice, that you have to live on other beings. Anaximander himself did not consider, to my view, this being a poetic saying, but that's the commentary of Simplicius on Anaximander, and Simplicius himself is a commentator of Aristotle's physics. 520 or so, he probably wrote this idea on Anaximander. And Anaximander himself was saying this saying 900 years before Simplicius reports it. And in between these 900 years, something happened, namely the life form of Anaximander disappeared. And that's the reason why Simplicius believes that Anaximander is talking metaphorically. And we see the disappearance of this form of life in Plato's Socrates, where the distinction between nature and the human world are justice and laws made by humans, and nature is established. For example, in the Phaedrus or the Phaedon or in Nomoi, you always get Socrates arguing that there are no laws in nature, that there are no nomoi in nature, that justice and injustice is something that is only happening in the human world, and that he is interested in the human world. That's why he stays in the city and is not dwelling among the trees outside the city. That's what he says in the Phaedrus. So there is a gap opening up, at least at the time of Socrates, between talk about nature and talk about justice and politics, which was not there at the time of Anaximander. And that's the reason why Simplicius believes that Anaximander is talking in a poetic or metaphorical way. If you take Max Black's interaction view of metaphors, then metaphor link to realms or regions that originally have nothing to do with each other, and the metaphor produces a new meaning. And the standard view about this is to be found in Mary Hesse's description about metaphors in science, which most of you will know. For example, in electromagnetic theory, when the talk about waves in electromagnetic theory started, the realm of water, where you had a theory how waves propagate, was applied to electromagnetic phenomena like light. And that led to a certain theory of propagation of waves without a medium, which you do not have in air or water. And that's how Simplicius considers Anaximander. There is a realm of justice and there's a realm of nature, and somehow Anaximander combines these two realms that do not belong to each other and creates a new meaning. But that's a totally false perception of Anaximander. He's not combining something that has been separated, but he is working in a language and a form of life where this separation has not existed yet, or does not exist yet. So Dike and Adike are not just terms that apply to the human world for Anaximander, but they are universal terms that apply to anything. And the distinction that was introduced after Anaximander that separates these realms is much more fundamental than the distinction between mind and matter, about which Alfred North Whitehead, for example, talks when he talks about the bifurcation of nature, that nature or subjectivity is not to be found really in nature anymore after modern science. This is a much more fundamental bifurcation that has to do with what Professor Nussel just said, has to do with the difference between evaluative term and factual terms. Evaluative terms and factual terms were not separated in Anaximander's perception. Now, one person in modern time that tried to get back to Anaximander's perception, who tried to unify the talk about nature and the talk about justice and injustice was Thomas Hobbes. And you all know about his famous Leviathan from 1651, where he described the state as a sort of artificial man. And interestingly enough, the first word about this book that is usually considered to be a theory of politics and the state is nature. This book starts with an explication what nature is and says that nature is the art whereby God has made and governs the world. So what Hobbes is doing is that he distinguishes first, that he eliminates the distinction between the natural and the artificial, and says that God is an engineer. That is against the Platonic and Christian background not so original, but that God is an engineer that has created the world as an artifact, and that humans are creating more artifacts by imitating the artifact of God. So we create machines which Hobbes considers to be artificial animals, and we create the state as an artificial animal by imitating God. And by dissolving the distinction between talk about nature and technology or artifacts, he is also dissolving the distinction between normative terms that are used in the human realm and factual descriptions that are used in order to describe the non-human realm. And by considering the state as a kind of animal, he might, I do not know enough about this, but he might produce a vision that is quite similar to some vision you get in Taoism, for example, in Zhangzi. I believe that by this, Hobbes came back to Anaximander also in the type of view he had about nature. He was politicizing nature, so to say, again, and used terms like competition, power, and war in order to describe what is going on in the natural condition of mankind, as he calls it, before the state as an artificial animal was founded. And what he first points out is that in nature there are problems with resources, that human beings, not in the state, but in their natural way of being, compete for resources and become enemies by competing for resources. We are preying on each other, like crocodiles might or lions might prey on us, so man preys on man and tries to destroy or subdue other persons in order to win in the competition for resources. And that's the state of nature, according to Hobbes. And this state of nature is difficult for humans, and they create the artificial state of the big leviathan in order to get out of the war situation, which he describes as a natural situation. So nature is not a harmonious totality in which we have an easy living, but it's a dangerous place. It's a place where war is going on for resources, not meaning that there is a constant battle going on, but the way Hobbes describes this state of nature is that it is a time in which you know that your fellow human creatures have the inclination to do harm to you or kill you if you are a competitor. And that peace is the state where you know that your neighbors will not do harm to you and will not kill you. And the peace is only happening when the leviathan has been constructed, when the artificial human has been constructed. But in nature itself, there is no peace. Or in Anaximander's terms, you have to pay for what you have used in order to stay alive by going down yourself. So what is very important for this view of nature is that you are in fear if you try to stay alive. That's just what is natural to all natural creatures who are in competition with other creatures. And Hobbes made this view so fundamental that in his autobiography he writes that he himself and fear were born at the same time, because when his mother was giving birth to him, the Spanish Armada was sailing to England in order to wage war against England. And you all know that many political theorists believe that the relation between different states is, if it is not governed by a big state, by a big leviathan, a state of nature. And Hobbes himself considered it that way as well, as Carl Schmitt did after him. So fear and war are the natural conditions of human beings that they try to avoid by constructing the big leviathan. And this term of the leviathan is picked up from Hobbes by Bruno Latour, the network thinker, and who talks about Gaia. And most of us, me included, might have thought that Latour's view of nature is much more harmonical than Hobbes' view, but Olivier Del Fabbro will tell you that it is not, and I hand over to him. Do I have to do anything here, or?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay,
Maybe.
I'm going to try to share my screen now.
Okay.
Okay, you can hear me and see my PowerPoint presentation.
Yes, very good, both.
Okay.
Please start.
Okay, so as Michael Hampe already said, I will continue with the second part on focusing mainly on Latour. And I'm just going to highlight one thing that I think is important, that could be called as Latour's Hobbesianism. And I take a quote from Graham Harman, who wrote a book on the political philosophy of Bruno Latour. And in the first pages of this book, he recalls an encounter that he had with Latour in Brazil. And I'm just going to read the quote to you. In July 2012, during a chance encounter with Latour on a sidewalk in Copacabana, we, so Graham and Latour, briefly discussed my plans for the present book. I asked about his earliest enthusiasm in political philosophy, and without hesitation, he answered, Hobbes. And now comes the important part. In retrospect, it was a question that hardly needed to be asked. And I think that Harman is right here to say that it's a question that hardly needed to be asked if you look at the whole works of Latour that he produced. Now, I'm not going to be able to reconstruct everything or all the points that Latour makes in regard to Hobbes. So I'm going to focus on two phases of Latour's work. The first one is the early 1980s, where especially the actor network theory was developed, and I'm going to focus on the later works, especially the book Facing Gaia. So I'm not going to talk about We Have Never Been Modern, for example, where Hobbes also plays an important role for Latour. So maybe just as a quick introduction for those of you who do not know the actor and network theory well, and those of you who know it but can't really recall what it is about, and those of you who know very well can express some criticisms later in the discussion. So what's the actor network theory about? Network theory about? It's I'm going to quote from a book that is called Irreductions. Irréduction in French, that was published together with the Pasteurization of France at the beginning of the 1980s. The translation comes from later. And at the beginning of this book, Latour already asks a very Hobbesian question. For example, when he says, what is a force? who is it? And then he goes on asking other questions, and he answers with it, well, in place of force, we may talk of actants. He enumerates other words here like weakness or entelechies, but I want to focus on the word actors. He then goes on to say that no actant is so weak that it cannot enlist another. Then the two join together and become one for a third actant, which they can therefore move more easily. An eddy, un tourbillon in French, is formed and it grows by becoming many others. So what's happening here, an actant can gain strength only by associating with others. Thus, it speaks in their names. So we can say here that actors form together a network when they associate, and then it grows. And it speaks when the last sentence here of the quote, it speaks in their names. I'm going to come back to this in 2 slides. So how does this association really work? Well, I'm going to go now into a text that Latour published together with Michel Calon, which is called Unscrewing the Big Leviathan, where you already feel the Hobbesian influence. And association can, I would say, be associated or described by the word translation, a word that Calon and Latour take from Michel Serres, from the communication theory of Michel Serres. And I'm just going to read the quote to you. By translation, we understand all the negotiations, intrigues, calculations, acts of persuasion and violence, thanks to which an actor or force, so you have again actor or force, takes or causes to be conferred on itself authority to speak or act on behalf of another actor or force. So you can see here these words, negotiations, intrigues, calculations, but especially violence, are concepts that also Hobbes is very interested in when he describes the state of nature, and later on also the Leviathan, or the emergence of the Leviathan. Then what does it mean to speak on behalf of another actor or force? Well, here are some examples. Our interests are the same. Do what I want. You cannot succeed without going through me. And this process of translation is in the end nothing else than a contract. So the contract, however, is merely a specific instance of a more general phenomenon, that of translation. Now, I said that I will be talking about what this speaking of means. And in fact, you come directly from the translation and the contract to the idea of the spokesman in the actor network theory. So whenever an actor speaks of us, he is translating other actors into a single will, of which he becomes spirit, yes, and spokesman. He begins to act for several, no longer for one alone. He becomes stronger, and he grows. Okay, so you could say that, to sum up a little bit, forces or actors associate in order to form a network. The process of association is a process of translation, meaning that actors become spokesmen of other actors, and this whole process constitutes the contract. And the more actors are integrated, the more the network grows. Now, this growing invites to think about the difference between macro and micro actors. And this distinction between micro and macro actors is defined by power relations. So I'm going to quote, there are, of course, macro actors and micro actors, but the difference between them is brought about by power relations and the constructions of networks. Let me just highlight here that for Latour and Calon, it's not obvious from the beginning if, doing analysis, if an actor or network is micro or macro. You need to really engage into the analysis of these networks and become an actor basically yourself. So this is the famous black boxing that they describe, and Latour in other texts calls it to follow the actors. So there's this methodological approach here that combines, that is added here. So let me just here take some conclusions of what I've just said. So I think there are 2 important points here. The first one would be an anti-anthropocentrism in the actor network theory, and the fact that there are always several leviathans being formed. So you might know that in the paper Unscrewing the Big Leviathan, the networks, the examples that are being analyzed are the Society of Baboons and Électricité de France. And both of these are, of course, described as leviathans that are formed through this contract and these translation processes. I will come back to this in the next slide. But there are other examples, of course, that Latour analyzed. These examples play a very important role. One would be the Berlin Key. Michel Callan analyzed the scallops of Saint-Brieuc Bay, and so on. So there is to highlight the anti-anthropocentrism one more time, there's this hybrid form in leviathans of economic, technical, political, and natural actors. Technical, the Berlin Key, for example, Électricité France, which is an economic company. So I'm just going to give you here one example in a longer quote, what it looks like when Latour and Callan use Hobbesian terms in order to analyze their examples, and at the same time they describe a state of nature as it is described in Hobbes. So I'm just going to start with the quote, "You want peace, so do I." So this is already, I think, a very Hobbesian position to take in. "Let us make a contract. Let us return to the baboons. Sarah," which is in this case a baboon, "is eating a nut. Beth appears, supplants her, takes her place, and her nut. Let us return to, they have a laboratory is studying the fuel cell. The engineers are questioned, their knowledge simplified and summed up. We shall have a fuel cell in 15 years. The Leviathan wants more because the contract has been formed. We have made a contract, but a third party appears who respects nothing and steals from us. So kind of an enemy. And then this third party is described, another baboon comes, other engineers come, and so on. So you can see how the actor concept is applied to all of these different concrete acts. All this is still the war of all against all, then they write. Who will win in the end? This is the important question also for Hobbes, but also for Latour. The one who is able to stabilize a particular state of power relations, as I described before, by associating the largest number of irreversibly linked elements. So this is how the Leviathan is able to stabilize by controlling power relations, basically. So again, here I would like to conclude, especially in regard to Hobbes, some things that seem important to me. And this would be, the first thing is, in the actor network theory, there seems to be not really a process of killing or a fear to be killed, as Michel Hampe described with Hobbes, and also no process of really dying and no process of suffering. So actors are there or not, they disappear, but there's not this process of being killed, dying, and suffering. So struggle, fighting, and war are the product of forces and behaviors of actors. And I would go this far to maybe say that it's very mechanistic. It's a very mechanistic view, I think. And in contrast to Hobbes, I think that for Latour, nature or reality or whatever's out there, of course, you could not say that this anymore in Latourian words, but it's not experiential. And this is what I meant with there's no process of suffering, being killed, and so on. So these actors are not described as experiencing this state of nature. Sorry. Okay, I'm going to jump now to 30 years ahead of time, almost, so to Facing Gaia. And again here, similar to when I talked about the actor network theory, the question would be, what exactly is Gaia for Latour? And he relates on Lovelock, of course, who came up with the Gaia hypothesis, you of course, or most of you know. And he says, well, Lovelock describes a planet that is alive, meaning that anytime you add an entity, even if it's a gas, a rock, a worm, or made of microorganisms, it vibrates with all the historical specificity of the other agencies intertwined in it. So here, I take this from a paper that Latour wrote in 2017. So the important point for Latour in regard to Gaia is not a god of totality, as the title of the paper says. It is not a part-whole relationship. Rather, it is these intertwined entities and networks, I would say, that influence each other. So I would say that Latour is not really distancing himself from his earlier actor network ontology, I would say. Now, I think one important point would be in Facing Gaia that I didn't see so much in his earlier works is that the state of nature is something that is coming. And I'm just going to read a quote to you. I think it speaks for itself. Today, Latour says in Facing Gaia, what is strange is that this state of nature is not situated as it was for Hobbes in the past. It is coming toward us. It is our present. Worse still, if we are not inventive enough, it could well become our future too. We have a war of all against each, so a state of nature, in which the protagonist henceforth may not be just the wolf and the lamb, but also tuna and CO2, plant nodules or algae, in addition to the numerous human factions that disagree about almost everything. So if you agree or disagree with Latour, it doesn't matter. I think he paints quite a picture here, saying that if you think about all the human factions that disagree about almost everything, so human warfare, right, that is going on right now in the world, and add to this even the Facing Gaia problem of climate change and so on, I think he's quite right of saying that the state of nature is coming towards us. We are in a state of nature. There are two possibilities for Hobbes to two possibilities for Latour to tackle this problem. And it is, as he says here on the left side, either you agree to distinguish the enemy from the friend, and then you are engaging in politics. And by this, you are able to strictly define the boundaries of very real wars. So you need to engage into a friend-enemy distinction. Through this, you get into politics, and then you can declare who you are at war with or not, or define who you are at war or not. The other possibility is to still live under protection of a state of nature, but here, let me highlight that here state of nature is not meant in the Hobbesian sense, but the old constitution of the moderns who still distinguish between nature and politics, and who still believe that the world is already unified, and where it's not possible to declare war. So let me here also highlight that the difference between friend and enemy in politics is something that Latour doesn't take from Hobbes, but it's something that he takes from Carl Schmitt, and he explicitly says it in Facing Gaia. So for Schmitt, it's exactly as it's said here. The friend-enemy distinction defines the political situation, and the famous saying is the sovereign is he who decides on the state of emergency. So it is he who can decide, and the state of emergency is the state of war. It is he who can decide to go into war or not. So this is already my last slide to conclude. What we have in Facing Gaia is we go from a state of nature to a war against nature, or a war against Gaia, we would have to say. And we need to invent a new leviathan at this point. So it's not anymore these leviathans that form themselves like in the 1980s, or maybe they do, but what is needed is a more I would say, a more encompassing leviathan, I would say. So I read from the left the quote: agreeing to go through a state of war in order to search afterward through diplomatic transaction for peaceful solutions. So this is the goal. Requires significant transformations in the way the collective presents themselves to one another. So, and again, to highlight this peace part, we must not abandon the project of seeking security and protection, peace and certainty under another leviathan. So what I want to highlight here is that security, protection, peace are also very Hobbesian words. So it comes back here to Hobbes. You might know that these other leviathan, this new leviathan that has to be invented for Latour, is this new republic that creates a realistic contract, as he says here, and is often also called Dingpolitik, making things public, where he relies on John Dewey's political philosophy. And lately in Ouatterir, he has been highlighting this assembly of representatives of territories that has also been described, that's also already being described in Facing Gaia. Now, I just want to bring something in regard to the Carl Schmitt reference. So I think that the friend-enemy distinction here helps Latour to, or is introduced for self-organization purposes for representatives of territories. So it is here where he leaves Hobbes behind to go to Carl Schmitt. But to conclude, I guess, as the title here says, I think the important point is here that we go from the state of nature to a war against nature in order to come to this new leviathan. So this is it. Thank you for your attention.